In the quiet, uneven streets of post-war Germany, a sense of hope and renewal lingered in the air, mingling with the dust of rebuilding cities. Factories that once churned out machines of war were now producing goods for civilian life, and people were eager to embrace anything that promised comfort or relief. In the midst of this recovery, a small pharmaceutical company named Chemie Grünenthal was quietly growing, aiming to stake its claim in the world of medicine. Among the bright-eyed scientists who worked there, one stood out: Dr. Lothar Venn. Tall, precise, and methodical, Venn carried himself with the air of someone who believed he could change the world with nothing more than chemicals and careful observation. He had grown up in a small village, watching his mother treat neighbors' ailments with a mix of home remedies and intuition. That early exposure to healing, combined with a fierce desire for recognition in the scientific community, fueled his ambition. Venn's latest project was a new sedative, a drug meant to calm the nerves of those restless with anxiety, insomnia, or morning sickness. The post-war population, fatigued from loss and uncertainty, was the perfect audience for such a remedy. The company had already tested several compounds with little success, but this one, thalidomide, showed an unusual stability in its chemical structure. Venn described it in his notes as gentle yet effective, calming without suppression, soothing without dulling. At first, it was intended for general use, but when anecdotal reports suggested that it reduced nausea in pregnant women, the focus shifted. A product that could comfort an anxious population while appearing safe for expectant mothers promised not only scientific acclaim but also substantial financial gain. The initial tests were conducted on laboratory animals, where results appeared promising. Dogs and rodents seemed unusually calm, showing no immediate signs of distress or toxicity. Yet in the background, a few subtle anomalies began to appear. Limbs occasionally developed in odd shapes, and certain litters were smaller than expected. These details were recorded by Dr. Renate Kroll, a young toxicologist who had joined the company straight out of university. She had a sharp mind and an intuition for detail that often left her colleagues in awe, but her observations were cautious, understated, as if she sensed the enormity of what she was seeing but feared speaking too loudly. When she raised questions, she was met with polite dismissal. The culture of the company was one of optimism and forward momentum. Hesitation was considered weakness. The management, led by a charismatic executive named Hans Dorner, focused heavily on marketing potential rather than the anomalies. Dorner had a knack for persuasion. His office walls lined with glossy posters of happy families and professional endorsements. He envisioned thalidomide as a household name, the symbol of modern medicine's promise. Researchers who suggested otherwise were encouraged to redirect their efforts. Venn, caught between his scientific curiosity and the company's ambitions, chose compliance. He rationalized that the anomalies could be explained away or were too minor to matter. After all, the human trials had not yet begun. By 1957, thalidomide was ready to be released to the public. Advertisements described it as the solution to nervous tension and hinted at its miraculous effect on morning sickness. The marketing campaign was subtle but persuasive, emphasizing natural relief and peace of mind. Pharmacies stocked it eagerly, and doctors were quick to prescribe it, trusting in the reputation of Chemie Grünenthal. Soon, young mothers across Germany were taking the pills, holding on to the hope that this small white tablet could ease their discomfort and safeguard their unborn children. Behind closed doors, Kroll continued to document the irregularities in animal tests, carefully noting patterns in skeletal development that suggested deeper, more concerning effects. She became increasingly uneasy, realizing that the enthusiasm surrounding the drug might be blinding everyone to something catastrophic. Despite this, she kept her findings in a drawer, knowing that challenging the company's authority could end her career. Venn, too, wrestled with unease late at night in his office, staring at reports, wondering if ambition had clouded his judgment. As thalidomide made its way into households, its journey was celebrated as a triumph of science and hope. Families, weary from the hardships of war, embraced it as a miracle in a bottle. Yet beneath the surface of this wonder drug, subtle dangers lurked, invisible to the eye, but potent enough to shape the lives of countless future generations. What was meant to soothe and heal carried the seeds of disaster, and no one fully understood the depth of what had been unleashed. In the excitement of discovery and profit, the first chapters of a global tragedy were quietly being written. By 1958, thalidomide had moved far beyond the polished laboratories of Chemie Grünenthal and into homes across Europe, Australia, and Canada. It had become a symbol of post-war comfort, a small white promise of relief for sleepless nights and queasy mornings. In the bright offices of the company, sales charts climbed steadily, and Dr. Lothar Wenn's face appeared in magazines as the embodiment of modern pharmaceutical brilliance. He had become a figure of admiration, a man who seemed to have bridged science and society with a single, seemingly harmless pill. Behind closed doors, Wenn was not entirely untroubled, but he buried his unease beneath the tidal wave of success and the meticulous order of his office. He would remind himself that the anomalies noted by Dr. Renate Kroll were inconclusive, that animal studies often produced irregularities that never manifested in humans. The public, however, had no reason to doubt the miracle of thalidomide. Advertisements showed mothers cradling newborns, fathers holding hands with expectant wives, all of them smiling beneath a soft pastel glow. The company even coined a slogan, "Just married, just relax." It was catchy, evocative, and entirely misleading. For every smiling image, a few invisible tragedies were quietly emerging. Babies were being born with deformities that baffled doctors and terrified parents. But early cases were isolated, scattered, and easily dismissed. Medical journals reported the anomalies cautiously, often attributing them to genetic variation or coincidence. Even when patterns began to emerge, the evidence was buried under glowing accounts of thalidomide's success. Among the first to notice the connection was Dr. Martin Fay, an obstetrician in London. He began seeing cases that defied explanation. Babies with unusually short arms or missing ears, conditions he had rarely encountered in his decade of practice. Initially, he assumed the cause was environmental, a rare mutation, perhaps a combination of diet and stress, but the repetition was unsettling. Every mother whose child presented with these defects had taken thalidomide during pregnancy. Fay began recording cases meticulously, his notes growing into a hidden ledger of accumulating concern. The more he documented, the more impossible it became to ignore the mounting evidence. Back in Germany, Dr. Renate Kroll faced a different kind of battle. She continued her quiet investigations, compiling data from laboratory results and early human reports, constructing a statistical picture that should have been alarming. When she attempted to present her findings to supervisors, she was met with polite yet firm resistance. Kemi Grunenthal's management argued that her conclusions were speculative and that the company's reputation would suffer if preliminary observations were made public. They reassigned her to administrative duties, effectively removing her from active research. Kroll knew the consequences of her silence could be catastrophic, yet the bureaucracy and corporate ambition weighed heavily against her. Meanwhile, the corporate engine roared forward. Hans Dorner, the executive in charge of marketing, oversaw a campaign that positioned thalidomide as a near-magical solution. He cultivated relationships with doctors, offering samples and emphasizing positive results. Financial reports painted a picture of unending growth, with profits surging month after month. Wenn, despite his lingering doubts, rationalized the company's approach. Human trials would eventually clarify risks, and in the meantime, the benefits seemed undeniable. He told himself that progress always involved risk, that every innovation carried uncertainty. As thalidomide reached further into the hands of pregnant women, the consequences of ambition and oversight began to accumulate quietly, almost imperceptibly. Families celebrated the promise of relief, unaware of the invisible danger lurking in the pills. Midwives whispered concerns, nurses noticed patterns, and small clusters of deformities appeared in hospitals across multiple countries. Yet the public face of the company remained cheerful and confident, a mask of reassurance against the growing storm. Behind this facade, the tension in Kemi Grunenthal was palpable. Kroll continued to hide her data in her apartment, a silent record of what could become a global crisis. Wenn increasingly wrestled with the dissonance between scientific caution and corporate ambition. Yet he remained complicit, trapped in a system that rewarded conformity over conscience. By the time international reports began to trickle in, the foundations of a disaster had already been laid. What had been marketed as a gentle, comforting drug was quietly sowing the seeds of tragedy. The world was still smiling, unaware that the first signs of horror were emerging in the most innocent of places. By 1960, thalidomide had become a ubiquitous presence in households across Europe, Australia, and Canada. The small, white tablets were everywhere, advertised in magazines, promoted in pharmacies, and recommended by doctors who trusted the glowing reputation of Chemie Grünenthal. Pregnant women, exhausted by nausea and anxiety, found relief in a single dose, unaware that each pill carried consequences that could stretch far beyond their immediate comfort. The drug was marketed as a gentle, almost magical remedy, a symbol of modern medicine's power to soothe both body and mind. Television advertisements depicted happy families in pastel-lit kitchens, smiling mothers cradling their bellies, fathers gazing with pride and confidence. The slogan, "Just married, just relax," had become more than a catchphrase. It was a promise that comfort and safety could be bought in a small, unassuming package. Behind the cheerful facade, however, unease was beginning to grow. Midwives and doctors in several countries started noticing troubling patterns. Babies were being born with missing or shortened limbs, deformed ears, and other abnormalities that seemed almost impossible to explain. Hospitals whispered about the anomalies, but these murmurs were largely confined to private records and personal notes. There was no public alarm yet, no mass recognition of the scale of what was happening. The first cases were sporadic, appearing in isolated regions, easily dismissed as coincidence or rare genetic accidents. But as the months passed, the clusters began to grow, forming patterns that were impossible to ignore. In the United States, Dr. Evelyn Crane, an FDA reviewer known for her meticulous approach and unwavering commitment to safety, began to notice reports from European medical journals describing unexplained birth defects. She recognized the name thalidomide and understood immediately the potential for disaster. Unlike many of her colleagues, she refused to approve the drug for the American market, insisting on more thorough testing before it could be distributed. Her caution was initially met with skepticism, some even labeling her decisions overly cautious or obstructionist. Yet in hindsight, Crane's insistence on rigorous evaluation would prevent thousands of cases in the United States and underscore the consequences of complacency in drug approval processes. Meanwhile, in Germany, Dr. Renate Kroll continued her quiet documentation of irregularities. Each new piece of evidence strengthened her conviction that thalidomide was the cause of the emerging deformities. She painstakingly recorded patterns of limb reduction and cranial malformations in laboratory animals and correlated these findings with early reports from human births. Every entry in her notes felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of the unfolding tragedy was pressing directly onto her conscience. The company, however, remained unmoved. Supervisors insisted that the anomalies were either irrelevant or explainable by other factors, dismissing her meticulous work as alarmist. Kroll's commitment to the truth became an act of defiance. She began hiding copies of her research in her apartment, fearing that if the company had access, it would disappear forever. One night, she returned home to find her files gone. There were no signs of forced entry, no apparent theft of personal belongings. Only her data vanished. She understood instantly that someone wanted the truth silenced. The incident left her shaken but not defeated. If anything, it steeled her determination to ensure that the evidence survived, even if she alone had to guard it. At the same time, the reach of thalidomide was expanding. Chemie Grünenthal's marketing campaigns had penetrated almost every corner of society. Doctors relied on the glowing research reports produced by the company, assuming that proper testing had been conducted. Families trusted the soothing words of advertisements and the assurances of medical professionals. The first murmurs of concern remained isolated, fragmented, and largely ignored. But each affected child, each unexplained birth defect, represented a crack in the illusion of safety. As 1960 drew to a close, the seeds of a global scandal were firmly planted. Thalidomide was celebrated as a triumph of post-war medicine, yet the warnings of Dr. Kroll and the cautious steps of Dr. Crane hinted at a far darker reality. The quiet accumulation of anomalies, the hushed concerns of midwives, and the missing research files all pointed to a truth that the world was not yet ready to face. Beneath the smiles and pastel advertisements, a silent storm was gathering, one that would soon erupt with consequences that no one, not even the most optimistic promoters of the drug, could have anticipated. The era of unquestioned trust in a miracle pill was nearing its end, and the hidden disaster within thalidomide was poised to emerge from the shadows. By late 1961, the quiet whispers surrounding thalidomide could no longer be contained. Reports of unusual birth defects had multiplied, emerging from clinics and hospitals in multiple countries. The anomalies were no longer isolated incidents but patterns too consistent to ignore. Babies born with shortened arms, missing legs, malformed ears, and other severe deformities. Each case carried with it a shock that rippled through families, communities, and medical circles alike. Yet even as the evidence mounted, Chemie Grunenthal maintained a facade of calm. Executives issued statements assuring the public that the drug was safe, labeling reports of harm as coincidental and unverified. The company continued to defend its wonder drug aggressively, promoting the millions who had taken it without incident and dismissing those who suffered as unfortunate anomalies. Journalists were among the first to piece together the human toll into a coherent narrative. Anton Bremer, a young reporter from Düsseldorf, began collecting testimonies from affected families, doctors, and nurses. Each story he encountered was heartbreaking. Parents struggling to care for children born with severe deformities, their hopes for normal family life shattered. Bremer meticulously documented each account, sensing that he was uncovering more than isolated tragedy. He was witnessing the emergence of a global scandal. His articles, initially published in local newspapers, sparked outrage in small circles, but broader attention was slow. Governments were hesitant to intervene, and the pharmaceutical industry's influence kept much of the information confined to medical journals or regional press. In the midst of this growing crisis, Dr. Lothar Wendt disappeared from public view. Once celebrated as the face of pharmaceutical innovation, he retreated to the private shadows of Germany, leaving behind a career, a reputation, and a wealth of unanswered questions. Rumors circulated that he had fled to South America, seeking to escape scrutiny, though no evidence ever confirmed his exact whereabouts. His absence left a void in both the scientific and corporate leadership, further destabilizing a company already struggling to contain the unfolding disaster. Meanwhile, Dr. Renate Kroll resurfaced, determined to see her hidden research serve a purpose. The data she had safeguarded in secret became crucial evidence, illustrating beyond doubt the link between thalidomide and birth defects. The stolen files that had vanished from her apartment reappeared anonymously at a local newspaper, allowing journalists to finally report the findings with accuracy and authority. Who had returned them remained a mystery, but the timing could not have been more critical. Kroll's quiet persistence ensured that the truth, long suppressed, finally reached the public eye. Across the Atlantic, Dr. Evelyn Crane watched the situation with a mixture of horror and vindication. Her earlier refusal to approve thalidomide in the United States had prevented countless cases of deformity, but the growing disaster overseas underscored how thin a line existed between safety and catastrophe. Crane used her position to advocate for stricter drug approval processes, emphasizing the importance of careful testing and vigilance in protecting vulnerable populations. The unfolding scandal prompted government investigations, legal inquiries, and widespread media attention. Chemie Grunenthal faced mounting pressure to withdraw the drug, though executives continued to minimize the scope of the damage. Families demanded accountability, and public outrage grew in response to the shocking images of affected children. The initial denials of harm gave way to frantic damage control, as the company scrambled to contain a narrative that had already spiraled beyond their control. By the end of 1961, it was clear that thalidomide was no longer merely a pharmaceutical innovation. It was a global catastrophe. The perfect image of modern medicine, carefully cultivated over years of marketing and public relations, had cracked under the weight of undeniable human suffering. Patterns once dismissed as coincidence were now recognized as undeniable proof of a disaster that could have been prevented. The combination of corporate greed, scientific oversight, and regulatory lapses had created a tragedy of unprecedented scale. The world began to reckon with the consequences. For families, the damage was permanent and deeply personal. For scientists and regulators, the scandal became a cautionary tale about the dangers of prioritizing profit over caution. And for the media, it represented a victory of investigative persistence over corporate obfuscation. Thalidomide had moved from a celebrated miracle drug to a symbol of failure and neglect, its story exposing the dark intersection of ambition, oversight, and human cost. The unraveling was just beginning, but the lessons were already clear. Even the most celebrated advances could hide the potential for unimaginable harm. By 1962, the thalidomide crisis had reached a level of public awareness that could no longer be ignored. Families across Europe and other parts of the world were grappling with the devastating reality of the drug's effects. Children born with shortened or missing limbs, malformed ears, and internal complications were becoming an undeniable symbol of human suffering caused by a single pharmaceutical mistake. Hospitals filled with doctors and nurses who had seen these anomalies for months now faced parents desperate for answers. The questions were relentless, and the answers, when they came, were harrowing. The world had entered a new era of pharmaceutical accountability. Though the cost was measured in thousands of lives irrevocably altered, Chemie Grünenthal, once proud of its achievements, now struggled to manage both the scandal and its crumbling reputation. Executives scrambled to control the narrative, issuing statements that emphasized the small number of affected individuals compared to the millions who had taken the drug without incident. Public trust, however, had been shattered. The media published harrowing images and first-hand accounts, and these stories painted a stark picture of corporate negligence. Politicians faced mounting pressure to regulate pharmaceutical companies more strictly, and scientists demanded rigorous reforms to prevent a repeat of such a disaster. Dr. Renate Kroll, who had risked everything to protect and document the truth, became a key figure in exposing the full extent of the damage. Her detailed research and meticulously preserved records provided indisputable evidence that linked thalidomide directly to the birth defects that were now being documented worldwide. She was finally recognized for her courage and insight. Though the recognition could never undo the suffering already inflicted, Kroll continued to advocate for survivors and their families, pushing for medical support, compensation, and stricter regulatory oversight. Her efforts helped set the stage for modern drug safety protocols and inspired a new generation of scientists to prioritize ethics over ambition. Legal battles erupted as families sought compensation and justice. Lawsuits were filed against Chemie Grünenthal, and the company faced international scrutiny. Courts examined evidence that detailed not only the drug's devastating impact, but also the internal knowledge of its potential risks, which had been systematically ignored. The proceedings revealed a chilling portrait of corporate greed and scientific compromise, demonstrating how ambition and profit had overshadowed the most basic duty of care. Survivors of thalidomide became living testimony, their stories resonating in courtrooms and media outlets alike, forcing society to confront the human cost of negligence. Meanwhile, the medical and scientific community faced a reckoning of its own. Regulatory bodies, including the FDA and European counterparts, began implementing stricter testing and approval processes to ensure that no drug could reach the public without extensive scrutiny. Dr. Evelyn Crane's early warnings in the United States were now hailed as prescient, highlighting the importance of vigilance, caution, and ethical responsibility in drug evaluation. Pharmaceutical companies were compelled to rethink their approaches, realizing that public trust could be destroyed by a single oversight, and that the consequences of neglect were both moral and financial. In the decades that followed, survivors of thalidomide grew into a global community, advocating for rights, medical care, and social recognition. Their resilience and determination forced governments, companies, and societies to acknowledge the mistakes of the past while pushing for reforms to prevent future tragedies. Chemie Grünenthal eventually faced significant legal settlements, and the scandal became a cautionary tale taught in medical schools, business ethics programs, and regulatory agencies around the world. Thalidomide's story, once framed as a triumph of modern medicine, became an enduring reminder of the fragile balance between innovation and responsibility. The miracle drug that promised comfort and relief had instead unleashed a wave of suffering and loss that could not be erased. Yet from this tragedy arose change, stricter regulations, improved drug testing protocols, and a collective commitment to place human safety above profit. The narrative of thalidomide serves as a haunting but essential lesson that the smallest pills can carry consequences far beyond the laboratory, shaping lives and history in ways that no advertisement or promise could ever anticipate. Even now, the echoes of thalidomide linger in hospitals, in courtrooms, and in the hearts of families forever marked by the crisis. It is a story of ambition, oversight, and courage, of failures that caused unimaginable harm, and of individuals who stood against silence to reveal the truth. The legacy of thalidomide is both a warning and a call to vigilance, reminding humanity that the pursuit of progress carries with it the responsibility to protect those most vulnerable. The world may have survived the immediate crisis, but the lessons endure. etched into collective memory as a testament to the costs of neglect and the power of accountability.